A nice question for the starting to speak about theft in regards to freedom, especially in terms of digital privacy and the common goods. What I would like to pose as a couple of terms that are connected to digital rights and digital commons is the idea of the commons and creativity and the dubiousness of both two terms, and then also the idea of public domain. What does it mean in relation to commons? And I would like to look at theft or stealing as something not necessarily from the legal criminal point of view and not necessarily from ethical and moral point of view, but more theft as a tactics of how to challenge certain structures that disable the usage of something that I would call commons in the digital space. So, of course, we have to acknowledge that there has been acts of theft and this kind of strategies in art for quite a long time. I would like to pose one example, which is like stealing of things, but it's got to do also with the context. That's the artist Ivan Mudo, who you probably are familiar with. He's a Bulgarian artist who was stealing small fragments of different artworks in order to sort of make efflux-like suitcases and make propose a sort of Bulgarian national collection which did not exist. His act of stealing was not something that we would see necessarily as something as flaw, but more a kind of strategy with which he would point out that practicing art is always done in sort of a colonial art history. So he was always challenging the Western museums. And closely related to the work of Mudo is also the collection of Moderna and the strategy of getting the collection of Moderna. Not that Moderna would engage in any kind of illegal actions, but the strategy still remains the same, how to enable the kind of making the public domain something which is unattainable. And to note also, Mudo is a part of Moderna's collection. So this is basically a challenge of how to form a dialogue between the Western and Eastern art hemisphere in regards to theft. Also Moderna, or this like non-normative behavior, Moderna I think was about 10 years ago, had one curious exhibition which was entitled Seven Scenes, Ljubljana, Moscow, and they were the 7 scenes of the Eastern art through which Eastern artists identify are, for example, collectivism, utopianism, masochism, cynicism, laziness, non-professionalism, and the love for the West. And theft, as one of the strategies, does come very close to all these points of identity, which are viewed as negative or deficiencies or weaknesses. But I would like to. Huh?
The name is La for West.
Yeah. La for West without the de. Okay, so it's without this. Weaknesses, but pointing out the virtue is something which is usually criminalized. So now to come to the criminal behavior, the criminal behavior in itself is not an objective thing, it's something that is subjective to the context. So the theft in digital realm may also be viewed as a form of virtuous behavior. Theft often plays a disruptive rather than a destructive power. That's been a lot of talk yesterday about the confrontations and antagonisms, but what I think that theft in itself creates is more ambiguousness and contradictions, another kind of rebellion. that is not necessarily confrontational. For example, the digital artists would use certain kind of trophies which are similar to what Moodle uses, but these are usually like infringement letters. And one Italian curator, Simona Lodi, in one book humorously pointed out that a tactical media artist would not need a very good galleries, but would really need a very good lawyer, because they work with like challenging boundaries between art and freedom, and the end of techno-utopias, and the way businesses and the way business and corporations have co-opted hacker values, open source initiatives, and web freedom. I mean, this has all been devoured by the market, basically. This means that they are stealing digital data when the interest of the commons was transformed into private compensation. So when something is privatized and the hacker identifies it, that the sort of access or the freedom has been challenged, then they disrupt this, and this is usually the way of disruption is like pointing out some sort of a culturally good behavior or something like that. So one of the cases, I'm going to point out a few different ways of theft. One of the theft is stealing of identities, and as you know, most of us are to some extent paranoid of how much of our digital data can be manipulated, and I think Burak will talk about this manipulation of data more later. But one example, which is also very humorous and also needs a lawyer, for example, was the Italian duo Alessandro Ludovico and Paolo Cirio. I think it was 4 or 5 years ago. They stole 1 million Facebook profiles. I mean, they're both hackers and they're both programmers, but also artists and theoreticians. So what they did is steal these Facebook profiles and repurpose them via OCR, object character recognition, to characterize 5 different characters and then use them, or 6 different characters, and then use them on dating website, which was outside of Facebook. And of course, this reappropriation of the data that was owned and freely, voluntarily given into slavery to Facebook was repurposed, and of course they were sued and they had to close it down even before Transmediale Festival closed. But the challenge really was to ask how much are we aware of the policies, what identifies our freedoms with the usage of social media, for example, which presents itself as very open, and how much our personal data is vulnerable in this sense. So the values which hackers and artists assign to a particular stream of data may also vary in form. Usually they use some forms of pranks or confusions or memes, or one next point of stealing is stealing of time. And stealing of time has been done by hackers most usually. What we hear about, that they hack in and they completely block the queries done through one server, so that the computer that is accessing that server becomes completely blocked and effectively useless. But how artists are stealing time is like in various ways. So, because another call of various initiatives is really grounded in copyleft movement. So that the theft is only a consequence of inadequate and inappropriate restrictions of sharing digital content. In this regard, when not done for personal or selfish reason by hackers, the piracy and theft is not an act of violence, but rather an act of kindness. It is aimed at promoting the allowance of cultural ambivalence, and it delineates from antagonism, which I was mentioning before. For them, the act of liberating data is predominantly not about being a conflict, but about being available for all, and in this I do see commons. In this movement, the right to share and willfully renounce the market value of the cultural product is to allow to collaborate in collective modes of creativity. The creator of open source do not disown their work, only allow for it to change and grow and enhance and shift. This is the way it is formed, and in some kind of enthusiasm, this is like a sort of a techno-determinism or a gift economy between different hackers, which is opposed to the economy that we live in. It must be noted that geek communities also have their own morals and ethical codes of always being free, that one cannot just observe it, like take it for their own. There is also a sort of naivety in this. I myself belong to a DIY culture, and this is something that I think that maybe even 5 years ago we believed that it's going to bring different interfaces, but now we are faced with the fact that this does not penetrate really the dominant narrative, but what it does is maybe to some extent like more like vegetarianism, you know, just like correct a few, make us a little a little bit less consumerist. So one other example of stealing time would be an artist, Johannes Kreidler, who created probably the most illegal sound art piece ever made on the face of the earth. He used 70,200 samples for a 33-minute, 33-second noise composition. And he has done that to challenge the strict bureaucracy of how copyrights were handled in Germany and are still handled. And the problem with handling copyrights through this general unions for musicians is that those musicians who do not follow the logic of pop culture and accessibility and clickability, then they fall out of the benefits of this money that is collected for like a common good, which is then not distributed commonly, but in the logic of who is the most popular. So one of the examples, which I find quite humorous as well, challenging this idea who is actually the owner of the rights, was the Radio Zona. This is a local radio art station, and they recorded the song of the birds, and then through the emissions of the radio they were asking who is the artist of this sound piece. Are the birds the owners of the rights, the one who pressed the record button, the one who played it on the radio, or the one who's listening? So it's really a valid question if we are talking about the commons. So we are all co-owning the soundscape basically, and then going further to the radio and everything, because SAZAS, which is like the Slovenian equivalent of GEMA, is actually controlling the radio the most strictly. I mean, radios are completely controlled by it. So, but in all this speech about accessibility and copyleft and everything, I noticed like a trap, that this is all the legal procedures are actually striving to normalize the behavior of sharing and stealing, basically. What began as a movement for the abolition of intellectual property has become a movement of customizing owners' licenses. Almost without notice, what was once very threatening as a radical movement now became something of an apologetic of info-capitalism. The rule is, when capital is threatened, it co-opts its opposition. And basically the process, one of the examples of this kind of fake process of inclusion may be, for example, the promotion of women computer programmers, which has been in fashion in the last years. So the idea of women programmers only became acceptable when there was a demand of women workforce on the market. By some estimates, by the year 2020, there will be a deficit of 80,000 computer science professionals in the Europe alone. That is why the women workforce must be exploited, and that's why women must be engaged in starting to program. So we cannot be so blind not to see that women are not just, women's profession are not just liberated through learning computer science, but they're all, like, the question is who is stealing what from whom here, basically. Are we deprived of rights and how? So the common, especially in the so-called brand of Creative Commons, is not an independent realm. It is a dynamic object that falls into the field of forces defined by the law and the value and production. The network economy and the monopolies of communication can now easily exploit exploit the self-provided free culture without imposing any form of traumatic enclosure for the strict regime of intellectual properties, because the Creative Commons liberated it for the market. You know, it's that twist. So the digital commons are not at all autonomous. One idealized version of the commons as a product of networking culture bears another trap, which is often neglected, and this is basically my last point. All immaterial commons have a material basis, and we often forget that. The political terrain for media theory is not only in the digital production of knowledge, but in material reality of the so-called energetic unconscious, which is manifested in the energy crisis. The production of electricity and energy is in the heart of the mediascape. This is the very realistic impact of the digital life, which appears so purely immaterial and sanitized. It is one of the production forces that are behind the Anthropocene, which is causing earthquakes, droughts, and other natural disasters which humans are affected by. It is, of course, not the only driving force behind the conflicts, but is one of the often very overlooked ones. To illustrate this, I would like to use an example of an art piece for which I actually really forgot who made it. I think it was Telekommunisten, but the art piece itself was very low-key, very unattractive and non-entertaining. It was a simple algorithmic piece with calculation of energy consumption by one pirate server, providing peer-to-peer downloading of digital content. The use of energy in the span of 1 month was a pile of black coal of the size and volume of Cheops pyramid. So, like, this is the actual digital impact in the material world. Interesting. Yeah, this is something that we don't think of. Huh? This energetic interpretation of technology directly contests the dominant paradigm of media studies that totally reduce and neutralize the network to the dialectics of the two internal coordinates, which are the digital code and the flow of the information. And now coming to the end, this flow of information is often in a very idealized version of the free culture and Creative Commons, identified as a sort of a networking that is somehow producing the commons. And I'm sort of doubting that all this networking is producing commons. Also, I have been, as a part of DIY movement, I've been disillusioned in Firstly, the impact that it makes on the global market. Secondly, the self-righteousness of the movement, that it's trapped by its own morals and unable to see its own conflicts. And then thirdly, the disillusionment of the swift appropriation of any genuine change that the movement has in the info capitalism. So for the conclusion, I would pose a question that is really, I think, complex, of who is stealing what from whom and who is to decide a verdict of criminality.